I would like to welcome you to this workshop on integrating reflexivities into survey research. Sorry. So this research workshop is a joint collaboration of two IMISCOE standing committees. The Reflexivities in Migration Studies Standing Committee, which aims to push forward the reflexive and self-reflexive perspective in migration studies, and it's interested in how knowledge on migration is produced, circulated, and utilized. And the Standing Committee on Methodological Approaches and Tools in Migration Research, which is interested in pushing forward the debate on research methods in migration studies, which encompasses different variety of research methods. And we are very much looking forward to create and develop the platform or sharing our experiences on those methods and find the solutions to the challenges that we all encounter. And the two standing committees, you can look up our websites in order to see more about the activities. So one of those activities, joint activity, is a workshop that we are starting now, but we can also invite you already to the panels that we are organizing, the both standing committees are organizing for the 20th annual IMISCOE conference, which will take place in Warsaw from 3rd of July. And there will also be an opportunity to join online, as the conference will be in the hybrid mode. Then, of course, we have a lot of publications, training, networking activities, so please check out our websites. There is also a possibility to join the SCs, and please follow also our social media, including Twitter, where you can learn more about up-to-date, what we are up to right now. And why this idea about the workshop on integrating reflexivities into survey research? So reflexivities is usually associated with qualitative perspective, and but we decided that it might be very useful to translate it into survey research and also to somehow bridge this quantitative-qualitative divide. So what we would like to do today is to create a space which will allow for a reflexive discussion about survey research. We want to identify and understand different challenges and opportunities which come with this reflexive approach to survey research in migration studies. And when we first launched the call for contributions, we were very broad in what kinds of topics we want to cover. So we were thinking about the whole survey process, from the survey design, like designing the questionnaire, different sampling strategies, translation of the questionnaire, what are the categories used, especially in migration research, then the implementation, which can be challenging, especially in cross-national studies, the interviewer effect that comes into play, and also data analysis and the writing up of the research. We are interested both in primary and secondary data. And I think this broad overview of the issues shows us that reflexivity in survey research is an ongoing process, that we need to think about it throughout the whole survey process, that we have to add our reflexivity on ethical issues. And also what is key is the transparency with which we approach our methodological choices and why we made them and how. And we are very excited to have two very special guests today as our keynote speakers, Laura Morales from Sciences Po and Jessica Hagen-Zanker from the ODI, who kindly agreed to kick off our discussions with their insights on the survey research programs that they conducted. And this will be about an hour, and the first over an hour this will be the first part of the workshop. So about 3:20, we will break for 10 minutes, after which we will join again to listen to fascinating contributions, which came as a response to the call for papers that we issued. And there will be 5 presentations from Franziska Maier from University of Stuttgart, Rossanna Le Voir from the London School of Economics and Political Science, Rima Saini from Middlesex University London, Kesi Mahendran and Nicola Magnusson from Open University, and final from Mariña Fernandez Reino from Universitat Pompeu Fabra and Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. We asked all the keynote speakers and all contributors if we can record the speeches. They all agreed, but we wanted to make it clear that only the presentations will be recorded and discussions will not be recorded. So, you know, just to make just free and more informal discussion possible. So let us start with the first keynote speech. We have Laura Morales, who is a professor at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po. Her research interests lie in comparative political behavior, public opinion, political parties, politics of immigration, and comparative politics. And very importantly for this workshop, she acted as a chair of the Cost Action International Ethnic and Immigrant Minorities Survey Data Network. This network created, this was a network of 33 researchers from different researchers from 33 countries. And they were working on improving the access, usability, dissemination, and standards of survey data on economic, social, and political integration of ethnic and migrant minorities. So, Laura, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Justyna. And I would like to start by thanking everyone for all of the organizers for inviting me and having me today to present and share with you mostly elements relating to the process of how a very large number of researchers from all across Europe, how we work together to try to integrate both conceptual and methodological reflexivities in our sort of joint collaboration to create a number of resources that would be useful to the study of ethnic and migrant minority integration under multiple dimensions with survey data. So what I'm going to be presenting today, and I'm really very grateful to both standing committees of IMISCOE of giving me this opportunity, is the work that we did in the context of the Ethmigsurveydata network, which is also work that even if the funding is for now finished and completed, quite a few of us who were very actively involved in this collaboration are still striving to get funded and to continue working on. I hope you're all seeing the screen properly. If you don't, just give me a shout because I'm not able to see you anymore. Let me just first start by kind of very quickly introducing what was this Ethmigsurveydata collaboration. And hopefully the vast majority of you who work on survey research on migrant minorities across Europe or beyond Europe perhaps already know or have heard about the Ethmigsurveydata collaboration and some of the resources that we've created. But just as a kind of very quick introduction to this, this is a very large network that included more than 200 researchers that were specializing either on ethnic minorities or on migrant minorities or on both. From Europe and sometimes beyond Europe. So we had also colleagues from the US, Canada, Australia collaborating at some point in this network, and which was initiated originally through a cost action, the cost action called Ethmigsurveydata. And this collaboration has been ongoing with this cost action funding between 2017 and 2021. But in addition to that, it was supported with funding from the Horizon 2020 project SHOC, Social Sciences, Humanities, and Open Cloud, and a project funded for the team that I led at Sciences Po by the French Agency of National Research. And so the goal of these large collaboration was really to create a wide range of tools, of resources that would allow us to create sort of kind of research capacities into the study of the multiple and interacting and interlocking dimensions of inclusion and integration in the economic, social, and political domains through the study of survey data and through the analysis of survey data. And our main goal was to create resources that would allow being able to find such survey data, because one of the realizations of this network of researchers, and kind of one of the first motivating points, was that the data that existed was very much hidden. It was difficult to find. They were rarely visible, for example, in the social science data catalogs of the main national data archives, and there was a risk that this data could get lost and that it would become invisible forever. So our first goal was to try to compile what we've eventually called an ethnic and migrant minority survey metadata registry, which is essentially an online search tool that allows to find the survey data that exists following a number of patterns of searches that researchers, but not just academic researchers, anyone who's really interested in understanding what sort of survey data exists out there in Europe can actually use in a user-friendly manner. Our second goal was to try to generate a survey question bank that would allow researchers, again, academic or applied researchers, or people working, for example, in think tanks or in local, regional, national government units, primarily the statistics units, or those units that are actually devoted to undertaking various elements of social science analysis, to be able to find survey questions that they could perhaps replicate in their own surveys if they were planning for new surveys. And so we've done a first pilot of how to create such a survey question bank. And the third goal was to undertake a series of data post-harmonization exercises that would allow us to generate pooled data sets from existing surveys that were conducted independently from each other across Europe, and try to see which ones are comparable from the point of view of how their samples were designed and at which level of geographical aggregation and for which types of groups they were produced and undertaken, and whether they share similar questionnaires and question items that can be comparable, and try to pool them together so that we can sort of extract more information, and then primarily we can undertake comparative analysis with data that were previously conducted independently and not in a coordinated fashion. And in addition, a final core goal that we had in this large international collaboration is to design and implement what we call an ethnic and migrant minorities data playground that would allow to visualize some selection of these data sets, some of them standalone data sets, but that are comparative, but in other occasions, the post-harmonized pooled data sets. And this is a fourth goal that we're still is still in the pipeline. So we've started doing some work, preparatory work, to create the data playground, but actually we'll have to wait a little bit for further funding because it's still in the planning stage. Now, all of these four goals and four types of resources have been planned and sort of designed so that they can converge into multiple components of ethnic and migrant minorities survey data hub. And because I've shared the slides with the organizers. Those of you who are participating in today's workshop, you can get the slides either from their website or by email. You will be able to click on the links and find the Ethmigsurveydata Hub and follow those links there if you're interested in exploring them at your own time. So I'm going to present very quickly, and hopefully in the Q&A you might have other opportunities to sort of tease out some of the kind of more complex elements of how we incorporated conceptual and methodological reflexivity in each of the steps of building up these resources. And I'm going to focus first and foremost on the survey registry, because that's sort of the starting point from which the other resources are generated. But I will say a little bit also about the question data bank and about the post-harmonization exercise. So first of all, what is the survey registry for, and what does it include? In reality, the survey registry is meant, it has been constructed throughout these years, but also it will continue to be sustained and expanded over time in its capacity of being a kind of single point of access where researchers of any kind of interest, whether academic or policy applied, or just, for example, data journalists, can actually find a live census of existing surveys that are in good shape to allow us to study the integration or the inclusion in any of its multiple dimensions of ethnic and migrant minorities. And it is really important to emphasize that this registry, at least for the time being, is exclusively a registry of quantitative sample-based surveys. So it does not include qualitative studies or other types of studies, for example, experimental studies or quasi-experimental studies, because to a certain extent, the IMISCOE Research Hub sort of fulfills that role of providing information about those kinds of research and the publication. So we focus exclusively on quantitative sample-based surveys. And these are surveys that are undertaken in at least one of 35 countries that are primarily located in Europe or countries neighboring Europe that joined from the beginning this cost action and hence were included in the effort of compiling the list of existing surveys. This does not mean that we cannot expand in the future to other countries outside of Europe, but this would require actually teams from those other countries to make the initial effort of scanning and producing a comprehensive list of surveys in the same conditions and through the same methodology that we applied in the countries in Europe. And we sort of exclusively focus on surveys that were conducted since January 2000. Now, why January 2000? This was primarily a pragmatic reason. We needed to put some sort of a starting date, and for capacity reasons, we decided that starting with the millennium seemed like a good idea, and sort of covering around 20 years of survey data production was more than enough of a task and a complicated enough task to just restrict it to that period. Although you will be able to find a few, not very many surveys that go back before January 2000, when they were part of a time series that was already existing in the 2000. And in addition to that, we include only those surveys that include a sizable number of respondents of ethnic or migrant minority background. And by sizable, you can look in detail on the website what we mean. It really depends on whether these are surveys conducted to the general population or whether these are surveys conducted specifically targeting those minority populations. Now, the whole goal of the survey registry, and this was one of the kind of first points of methodological and what we could say in this case design reflexivity, is that the whole architecture and the whole collaboration was structured around the idea, the kind of the very powerful idea that we wanted to ensure that the resources that we were going to be collaboratively creating would follow what have become known as the FAIR principles. So the fact that data that it's produced in general, but specifically data that it's produced for scientific and research purposes should be findable, should be accessible, should be interoperable, and should be reusable. And as I will be detailing in a minute, all of the different sort of options and ways in which we decided to go about creating the registry, but also all of the other resources, very much reflects on the most appropriate and also feasible ways of creating and generating these resources in a way that we would actually promote and comply with these FAIR principles. And hopefully all of you will agree that actually we've done a job that allows people to find these surveys, that it allows them to access these surveys, and it allows them to reuse the surveys. But in addition to that, we've made sure that all of the elements of what we call the metadata, so the data about the data, so the technical information about the data, are generated in a way that they are interoperable, meaning that they can actually be easily shared both with humans and with machines through very specific and kind of universally recognized standards and protocols of information retrieval that are quite common in automated processes. And if you have questions about that, I can answer them in the Q&A part. So essentially, through these kind of main principles, the registry has become, and hopefully a lot of you will already be using the registry when you're trying to find what data exists out there in Europe on surveys on ethnic and or migrant minorities. It's meant to be a single access point for the information about what surveys exist, but also to provide high quality information through providing very detailed, informative and structured metadata, so information about the data itself, that allows to understand both very quickly in a single kind of gaze what the main elements, technical elements of those surveys are, but also then in detail get a very clear description of each of the surveys. And so the metadata for each of the surveys has been compiled using a very standardized process that it took us more than 1 year to discuss among this large network of colleagues and researchers that collaborated in the Ethmigsurveydata network, but also very importantly, each of these individual records of metadata that you can actually find undergo a very rigorous and multi-step quality control process that was also discussed in detail and agreed and tested numerous times in this collaboration. So what was the methodology that we used for compiling and producing this metadata? Actually, because the objectives were to try to generate this resource in the way that would be the most useful, but also the most user-friendly as possible, all of the stages of and multiple steps of conceptual and methodological debate and reflexivity actually took us to making a number of decisions that are quite important and that actually sort of in a kind of path-dependent way are reflected in the resource that you can use now. First, with the goal of ensuring relevance, we had to discuss how to delimit the scope and what types of surveys would be included, what sizes of samples would be included, and how we would actually decide on what surveys were in scope and what surveys would be out of scope. With the goal of ensuring comparability, we also discussed in a lot of detail how we would undergo and undertake the search process to actually find and detect the surveys, so that we would find the same types of surveys in all of the countries, and that we would not have a census of surveys that was a lot more detailed in some countries and very superficial in other countries. So we produced guidelines that were very specific to how to search for surveys. We also sort of undertook very detailed discussions on how to document the metadata, with the goal of being as complete as possible in the description of each of the surveys. And then we discuss, with the goal of validity and reliability in mind, how to establish the quality checks and what would be the multi-stage version control processes and quality control process. Now, part of this whole process of generating the registry and the metadata information about each of the surveys included discussing all of the variables that describe the surveys that you can actually find and read at your own time when you access the survey registry for the first time. But I will just concentrate on one of those variables, which is the variable that actually describes what are the main topics that are covered by the survey, because I think that this one variable illustrates very well the whole process of conceptual discussion, theoretical discussion, and reflexivity, both conceptual and methodological, that we used in this international collaboration to try to capture in a detailed and as comprehensive manner as possible the actual contents of those surveys. And one of these variables is the topic, the main topics that are covered by the survey. And after a lot of discussions and kind of iterative processes, collectively we came at a classification of 29 substantive kind of differential topics, that surveys that covered at least one element of inclusion or integration of ethnic and migrant minorities could potentially be covering. What this essentially, and you have that on the screen, entails is actually having a kind of very careful discussion across all of the researchers to try to map out all of the potential dimensions of integration, and of all of those potential dimensions of integration to come up with kind of a specific topics that could be commonly identified in surveys. As part of this topical classification, this actually sort of feeds our thinking into the other resources relating to the question data bank, which actually entail classifying question items into some of these topics and sort of larger dimensions of integration, but also very importantly, doing the same connection when we do the data post-harmonization and when we are classifying certain question items in a way that we want them to be at least sort of constitute a minimal common denominator across different surveys. Now, the end product is the search motor, the search platform that you can find on the Ethmigsurveydata Hub website, which is what we call the front end of the survey registry. So what most users can actually see, which allows them to search any type of surveys that they're interested in, specifically including samples of ethnic or migrant minorities, through a whole range of filtering options, keyword search, sorting functions, and the combination of both an abbreviated summary about the main context of the survey and access to the full contents of the survey. As of now, there are more than 1,800 surveys from 34 different European and neighboring countries, and you can see the numbers, the number of surveys identified in each of those countries on your screen. So this is a very powerful resource that I would really encourage all of you, if you don't know it already, to sort of explore and start working for your own research. Now, connected to this, and I'll be finishing in a couple of minutes. I've marked that I need to stop at 35 past. What did we do in relation to the question data bank? First of all, I want to very quickly say that at this stage, we've only had the resources, the financial and human resources, to do pilots for this question data bank, and the result of those pilots are already available online in the Survey Data Hub. And here what we do is that in the pilots we draw first on the survey metadata that has been compiled in the registry, but focus on a selection of countries, only on 10 countries out of the 34 countries that actually have generated this census of surveys. And what we do here is focus on a series of themes within this larger set of 29 themes that I already showed you on the previous slide that are covered in the registry. So we focus exclusively for the pilots on civic life and political participation, on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, and on topics relating to belonging, social identity, cultural and social norms. And the work that we've done actually consists of retrieving all of the questionnaires that sort of fit into any of those conditions, one of the 10 countries and one of these kind of 3 thematic focuses, retrieving the questionnaires and start linking questions to the hierarchy of concepts that we identified and I showed before. And then actually inputting the questionnaire metadata, so all of the questions and the classification of the questions into topics through a specialized software that is called Collectica. And actually, once this is done and it's put online, these questionnaires are actually harvested also by the European Question Bank through the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives. And here you will see how we match those topics that I just showed you that are listed in detail, the 29 topics that are listed in detail in the survey registry, to the integration dimensions that we identify. So the several integration dimensions can have multiple topics that are included into them. And you can actually check this comparison between dimensions and topics described in the survey registry at your own time if you're interested. And this required a kind of very detailed process of collectively working together to do a very detailed mapping that links dimensions with a sort of kind of broader concepts and narrower concepts, and then specific items in questionnaires that are linked to a specific question in a questionnaire. And finally, this links to what we're doing now and finishing now in relation to a pilot on post-harmonized data sets, which is another subset from which we only from the questionnaires that we've already been able to collect in this second question data bank, we select a subset of those questionnaires for which the data are actually freely available and that we can post-harmonize because there are no copyright issues or data protection issues involved, and using specific protocols, using STATA, we're post-harmonizing 2 common and comparable categories to produce post-harmonized sub-data sets. And with that, I hope to have given you an overview of how we try to integrate and incorporate both conceptual and methodological reflexivity in the creation of a number of resources that we expect will sort of be widely used by all of you attending this workshop and to your colleagues as well in the future, to be able to expand our capacity to compare research with survey data across Europe and beyond. And on this slide, you can find all of the links to our websites, Twitter, newsletter, and everything else that might be of interest to you. Thank you, and I'll stop there the sharing, and I'll leave the floor to Justyna and the organizers for the next steps. Thanks very much.
A huge thank you, Laura, for this impressive presentation. Not, only in terms of the endeavor, but also, complexity and, all the steps that you've taken on the way. So I invite all the participants to jot down their questions and comments, as the Q&A will come after our second keynote. So we will move now to Jessica Hagen-Zanker, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the ODI's Migration Research. She leads the ODI's contributions on 2 large-scale projects. One is MIGNEX, about experiences from which she will talk about today. And she's also working on MIDEC, South-South Migration, Inequality and Development Hub. Her research focuses on migration and development, migration decision-making, links between migration and social protection, humanitarian development nexus, and analysis of social protection programs and policies. And Jessica is also a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Yes, I invite you to take the floor, Jessica.
Thank you, Justyna, and many thanks to the 2 standing committees for inviting me today to talk about MIGNEX. I really liked the topic of the workshop, and it's really nice that through all of the presentations we're doing today, we can show just how important reflexivity is in survey research as well. So I also, hope to convince you of the of that in my presentation. So today I'm going to share some lessons from the MIGNEX survey. So I was in charge of the MIGNEX survey, which is one of the main big sources of data that we have in MIGNEX, and I'll tell you a bit more about the survey in a minute. But basically, it was a process that took years in terms of design and actual execution. So plenty of opportunities for reflexivity. Okay, so before I start talking about the lessons learned, I'm going to just briefly introduce the MIGNEX project, which I don't think all of you will know it. So the MIGNEX project is a project funded by the EC, Horizon 2020, and it's a project, a 5-year project, now 6 years, which is all about generating new knowledge on the migration and development nexus and how it links with migration policy. So we are 8 core institutions that are part of MIGNEX, and it's led by Jürgen Carling at PRIO. So we want to generate new evidence on migration and development, and we look at both sides of the migration and development nexus. So on the one hand, we're interested in how development impacts or affects migration, mobility or immobility. On the other hand, we're also interested in how migration actually affects development in areas of origin. So we're interested in basically all aspects of migration and development. So mobility and immobility, internal migration, regional migration, international migration, all of it, the entire spectrum. And in terms of development, we're also looking at it in a really broad, at the same time also very specific way. I'll explain that in a minute, but basically we're looking at development in terms of health, education, basic services, and many other dimensions. We have mixed methods data collection, which is now complete. So we did extensive qualitative data collection in each of the 26 research areas, but then also the survey. So yeah, I already mentioned we covered 26 research areas in the MIGNEX project across 10 countries in Africa, Asia, also have Turkey. So just in terms of development, I wanted to briefly expand on that. So we are looking at development not as a kind of one measure at the kind of country level, but we are looking at specific developments within the local areas which we're interested in. And we decided to look at these 9 different aspects of development. So, for example, some can be positive, others can be negative. A negative one could be a deterioration of the security situation. a positive one could be an educational expansion. And in our data collection, we paid specific attention to these 9 developments, and of course other aspects of development that came up. Some of those developments are intentional, so they are the result of specific policies that, for example, aim to increase the number of jobs, or that build infrastructure, or increased opportunities for education, for example, by building new schools. Others are not necessarily the result of specific policies, or not intentional in any case. And for all of these developments, we are interested in their interaction with migration. So how they affect migration aspirations or migration outcomes. And then again, the flip side, how migration affects these developments. So these are our research areas across the 10 countries. So you can see really broad geographical scope. The countries were selected in terms of being really important or critical in terms of migration dynamics, in particular also migration to the EU, but also by having really broad variety where possible in terms of national income, security situation, etc. So the MIGNEX survey specifically is, to our knowledge, one of the largest migration surveys. We have a sample size of just over 13,000 young adults who we interviewed in these 26 research areas. And the sample is roughly representative of young adults at the research area level. So the 26 research areas. I should add that young adults we define as 18 to 39-year-olds. So they were the specific sample that we looked at in our survey, and in fact in much of our research. And we decided to focus on that group because they are most likely to migrate. And in the survey, we have 228 survey items which cover different aspects of migration and development. Sounds like a lot, but it's also how we designed the survey, basically. So we have lots of very short and simple questions. But of course, there is also a lot of content we covered. And the survey database will be made open access when the project finishes. Potentially, yeah, so it finishes next year in 2024. So around maybe September next year, the data should be available. And yeah, I should add, an anonymized version of the data set will be made available. So it will look a little bit different to the data set that we're using internally now to really minimize the risk of identification of any survey participants, but we're paying really close attention to making decisions that really reduce the risk of identification while still keeping the data set as a really useful data set for other researchers. So trying to kind of balancing risk of identification with analytical value. So yeah, one example of reflexivity in the process. So that's kind of an aside. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 challenges we faced during the design and implementation of the MIGNEX survey. And basically, I want to give you some insights in terms of the kind of ethical, practical trade-offs we faced, and about and I guess our thinking in terms of how we navigate that trade-off. So yeah, first challenge was survey content. Second one is sampling, and then the final challenge was the actual execution of the survey. So the challenge in terms of content, I think this is a challenge that everyone faces when doing a survey. And it's that there's so many potential interesting questions that could be asked, so many researchers that tend to be involved, and everyone wants to have their own kind of special interest questions, their own pet projects in a way. So our challenge was that we have a very broad topic, migration and development. That's a gigantic topic. We had lots of researchers who all had their own interests. And also we needed data that was going to be used for different types of analysis. So not just your usual quantitative analysis, but we're also using it in the QCA analysis, which is also part of the project. So our challenge here was how to collect all the data that we need and want while keeping the survey manageable. So our ambition for the survey was to capture migration and development factors at the individual level, so for the 18 to 39-year-olds, also at the household level, so trying to collect some data and information on the respondent's household, but also the research area level. And we asked questions about the present situation, but also changes over time. So we have a set of questions asking compared to 5 years ago or in the past 5 years, but then also looking into the future. We wanted, so MIGNEX design and setup is all about comparing research areas. So that's why we have 26. So we really want to capture the differences between the research areas. So we made our survey tool as comparable as possible. And that meant that we really had to very much focus on having questions that can be comparable, or at least tailored in a very minimal way. But also meant that researchers working on specific countries or researchers just weren't allowed to add their own questions. And then the second last bullet point, I think, is a really critical one. And that's really one to always pay a lot of attention to. So making sure we collect all the data we need for the analysis. And I think researchers tend to be pretty good at that, even though, of course, sometimes we still come up with some questions that we would have liked to collect. But in general, people tend to be quite good at thinking about the analysis we'll do and what kind of survey items we need. But then I think the second half there is what I think we often don't pay enough attention to, which is ensuring that we actually use and need all the data that we collect. And that's the one where we try to be really strict on ourselves. So really thinking, do we need this? Are we going to use it? Isn't this other variable a good substitute and can be used instead? And then we also wanted to keep the survey length manageable, so 1 hour max. And we, I think, ended up with an average of about 45 minutes an interview. So luckily we were able to get it at quite a bit less than the 1 hour, because 1 hour is really a long time for an interview. So we had this very structured process to actually select the survey items to have in a survey. And one way we did that is by creating an Excel file where we had in the columns you see here, we had the different aspects of analysis. So they're not quite variables, but they're areas of analysis where we felt like we need data or we need variables to do this or to explain this. And then in the rows, we had potential survey items. And this process and really going through this again and again and thinking about it very carefully was a very useful way for actually reducing the number of survey items that were maybe interesting or kind of bonus survey items, but not really needed for the analysis. We are the pilot, which is, yeah, and so we were lucky that the pilots happened just before the COVID lockdowns. We piloted in 3 very different contexts, 3 different countries. So we had Ghana, we had Cape Verde, and then we also had Afghanistan, where we did a pilot, and that really helped us to simplify questions, to cut down on repetitive questions that respondents found annoying and would have not really answered properly anyway, and reducing lengths, but also, yes, sampling was revised as a result of the pilot. So that was survey content. So as you can see, a lot of thinking done there for a process that I think, unfortunately, is often quite rushed. We were actually quite lucky in terms of the timing. So we were unlucky, of course, that all our data collection was delayed because of COVID, but lucky in the sense that it basically bought us an additional year to design and finalize the survey, or not quite a year, but at least half a year, and for most countries, a year. So that really helped us to spend all the time we needed on the design stage. So sampling was another big challenge. So we had 26 different research areas. And for most of those research areas, we did not have a sampling frame that was available for us to use. At the same time, we did want to try and get as representative sample as possible. Yeah, we had to figure out a way of balancing logistics and knowing that there isn't up-to-date data and a sampling frame for many of these research areas, while at the same time minimizing our sampling errors. So the sample that we needed, we wanted to sample the general population. So by that we mean we wanted to sample all 18 to 39s in the research area, whether they be recent arrivals or born in the research area. It was really important for us to also capture people who had moved to the research area, so immigrants, because as I mentioned before, we were interested in, or we are interested in, all aspects of migration. We decided already at the proposal stage to have a sample size of 500 respondents per research area. So that was basically, I guess, a logistical decision that was taken very early on, but at least it made that aspect of the sampling process very easy, because we just had to work with that. And our target population was 18 to 39-year-olds. In terms of sampling, where we landed is we called it a lowest common denominator approach. We basically developed a sampling strategy that would work across all research areas. In some research areas, we would have had, and indeed had, sampling frames and quite detailed data that we could use to sample, to randomly sample respondents, and we did adapt the process slightly in a few instances to make use of that, but in general, we wanted an approach that would work everywhere. even though we had to opt for a lowest common denominator approach, we wanted an approach that doesn't compromise on rigor. So our sampling strategy in the end was a 3-stage stratified probability proportional to size cluster sampling strategy with a random walk. Quite a mouthful, and I'll just talk about a few of the elements. So one was how we developed the sampling frame. So as I mentioned, we didn't have up-to-date data or sampling frames for most research areas. I should also mention that research areas really varied. So some were entire cities or entire islands in the case of Cape Verde. Others were a specific area or suburb of a city, or others were districts. So there just wasn't data available on all of these areas. So first of all, we wanted to know how many people lived in the areas that we were interested in our research areas. And we also needed that data to develop our random walk. We used satellite maps to basically estimate the number of households that live in the research areas. And then, I don't know if that's on the next slide now, then we basically also used the data we collected to draw and identify our clusters within the research area. Once, a few stages on, once our clusters were selected, we used the random walk approach to sample our respondents within a cluster. And we really paid attention to make this process as systematic as possible, because random walks often get criticized, and rightly so, for being quite imprecise and introducing bias. And we thought very carefully about all the different ways in which bias could creep into a random walk. And we paid a lot of attention to developing very clear training materials, and spent a lot of time on this during the training to make sure that a random walk is done as systematic as possible. And here on the slides, you can see some examples from our training materials. And we also developed some videos, actually, which are also available on the MIGNEX website for others who are interested in using random walks. So how did it work in terms of executing our sampling strategy? So the sampling strategy didn't work as well in all research areas as we had hoped. It broadly did work, but in some research areas, the initial counts I mentioned, they were quite off from what the team then saw on the ground. So they had a higher margin of error in terms of the count on the ground compared to the count based on satellite maps. And that's because of, for example, new rapid developments that were just not reflected on the maps yet. Also high in or out migration and other reasons. And also actually linked to COVID and people being absent from certain areas. So there were some reasons why the numbers didn't always add up as well as we hoped. So there's likely some bias as a result of our sampling strategy. So I mentioned there were challenges related to migration. One challenge was that, for example, we saw this in Cape Verde, is that there were quite a lot of empty houses which showed up as proper households on the map, but they were actually migrant houses that are unoccupied for most of the year. And it meant that we overestimated the number of households in that research area. And sometimes we weren't able to fulfill the required number of households within a cluster because of such a high number of empty houses. In other research areas, we also had the issue of quite a lot of households actually not having an 18 to 39-year-old because of outmigration. So yeah, another migration-related challenge. And then, of course, we had the usual sampling challenges related to terrain and the weather, etc. Okay, so finally, execution of the survey. So the huge challenge there was that we had data collection involving 5 MIGNEX core partners. So most MIGNEX partners were involved. And then we also had 7 subcontractors. And at one point in, I think, June 2021, we had 5 countries in the field at the same time. And then all of this was during COVID as well. So the challenge here was, how do we execute such a large-scale survey during a pandemic? And I would say two main areas or 2 main issues that kept me up at night. One was the sheer logistics of running the survey across so many partners and countries, and then the other was the ethical issues of running the survey during a pandemic. But then there were also lots of conflict issues that came up. So just very briefly on both of those. So in terms of logistics, we again paid a lot of attention to making the approach very systematic, and we put a lot of monitoring and data monitoring issues in place, and lots of processes were very automatic or very well organized, which helped. And then in terms of the ethical trade-offs, which we had to navigate during the survey. So as always with ethical trade-offs, there's no right answer. And we had to talk to our partners, talk to colleagues, and basically make the decision which seemed best at the time. So with COVID-19, the big challenge was to decide when to start data collection. Of course, lots of considerations around the ethics of doing data collection in countries where hardly anyone's vaccinated. We only did the survey in 2 countries before vaccinations had started. This was in Cape Verde and Ghana. And that's because we had teams on the ground who could do the training and the survey without actually needing someone external to come in. And then we had lots of COVID mechanisms, precautionary mechanisms put in place, like testing, masks, etc., when the fieldwork did start. And on the whole, it did seem to work well, and we're not aware of MIGNEX researchers infecting anyone, but there were huge challenges. And for example, in Tunisia, we conducted the survey at a time when there was, I think it was a Delta spike at the time, and it really made the fieldwork a lot more complicated. And there were people who were really also really afraid to open the door. And with hindsight, we should have probably waited a bit longer in Tunisia, for example. The other big challenge in terms of ethics was the security situation. So we had some instances in Somalia and Ethiopia where there were smaller security incidents, which in discussion with the teams, we could kind of navigate and then continue. Afghanistan was a big challenge because most of the data collection took place in the month or 2 before the fall of Kabul. So we were really quite concerned and worried for the teams. Again, it did also really affect the nature of the data collected, so it was much harder to sample respondents, etc. But at the same time, we were balancing that with the kind of unique and extremely valuable data which we collect. And we did keep going in Afghanistan, and we did manage to complete the survey. So yeah, we got lucky. But in one of our Ethiopia research areas, in northern Ethiopia, we had to stop because it just wasn't possible with the security situation to continue. So finally, I just wanted to say that both the design and the execution of the survey are written up into handbook chapters, which are on the MIGNEX website. So we aim to be very transparent about our decisions and our trade-offs. So you can find a lot more detail on everything I've discussed today in the 2 handbook chapters. And then very finally, I just wanted to also kind of advertise that together with Jürgen Carling, I'm leading a PhD course, so a course for PhD students on survey methods in migration research. And in that PhD course, we talk a lot about the challenges and trade-offs that we've touched upon today. And the course will be running again next October, and you'll be able to apply soon if you're interested. So it would be really great to have some signups for the course. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It was fascinating to hear about all the challenges that you encountered in this large-scale project, and also, you know, how you came to find the solutions with the PhD course. That would be very relevant for the Meth Mig members, so we can also advertise it via our communication channels.
Great.
I would like to welcome everyone back at our workshop on integrating reflexivities into survey research. My name is Marta Kindler, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this part of our workshop. And we will start with, we have 5 excellent contributions. So we will start with the contributions. Each of the contributors has 10 minutes, and then we will have an open discussion. So I would like to ask first Franziska Maier from the University of Stuttgart. Please, Franziska.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. Okay. Now you can see it in properly,
yes,
right?
It's excellent.
Okay. Great. So I'm very happy to present some of my research today, which is on the preferences of German citizens about access to citizenship rights. And I'll be presenting some mixed method analyses that I conducted on this topic. This particular research project is part of a bigger research project where I also looked at how German citizens make sense of citizenship more broadly. So that allowed me to collect different types of data that I'm now trying to also put into conjunction with each other a little bit more. So I thought this was a good opportunity to present this here and discuss it with you. In this presentation, I will do 3 things. I'll first talk a little bit about the challenges of survey research on citizenship-related questions specifically, and how I've thought about tackling those challenges. And I'll then present results mainly centered around an open-ended survey question, which I subjected to qualitative content analysis, and some analyses on how I brought that into conjunction with a traditional survey measure. So first, on some of the challenges of studying preferences on citizenship via survey research, just very superficially as an introduction, one challenge is, of course, the complexity of citizenship preferences, so that they relate to many complex issues like migration, but also like the nature of democracy, for example. And also that questions around access to citizenship are complicated just because many ordinary citizens aren't always aware of all of the legalistic requirements and processes that are behind naturalization or access to citizenship. And from migration research, we know, of course, that immigration attitudes are subject to attitudinal ambivalences, and that they are often subject to polarized or contentious public discourses, which again might lead to in-survey research getting kind of off-the-cuff responses that reflect more a moment in time rather than deeply seated attitudes. And finally, particularly in the German context, migration history and migration discourses shift a lot, so the point in time, again, might make a big difference. And the way that I tackled this in this research project is to think about, in addition to survey data, also collecting discursive data that allows participants to make sense of and contextualize their opinions. And I draw a lot on research from deliberative democracy there, which has also shown in some results that deliberation can also be a useful, tool for conducting research, perhaps, because when participants deliberate, this has been shown to lead, for example, to the reduction of symbolic manipulation. So they're able to pick apart which attitudes perhaps they've picked up from public discourses and which are kind of inherent to their own values. And it leads to more founded opinions. So participants are better able to justify their views or attitudes or choices. And that has to do with the quote by Stoker that I've put here, which I think puts that nicely into perspective, that participants revise and develop their views in conversation with others. So the way that we talk about political preferences is often through discussing or talking about them. So allowing participants to talk about them also within surveys is perhaps a more natural way to measure how attitudes come about. And I would say that this is particularly interesting in the concept of citizenship research, because citizenship is also a national identity that is intersubjectively constructed and that is reliant on recognition from others. So as Lister emphasizes in this quote here, but as many others have emphasized, taking full advantage of the rights of citizenship may not only be reliant on whether those rights are made available, but also on whether other members of the society view claims to those rights as legitimate and justified. So the concrete question that I looked at in my research is the question of non-citizen voting rights, which I would argue is kind of one of the central rights, or is often said to be one of the central rights of citizenship, the right to vote, but that is also part of a contentious theoretical debate about who should and should not have access to the right to vote. And in my survey, I asked an open-ended survey question that asked participants to list all arguments that they see in favor and all arguments that they see against granting voting rights to non-citizen residents who have lived in Germany for at least 5 years. And I subjected those responses to qualitative content analysis, and there are 3 categories that emerged. The first was commonality and obligation, which revolved around shared culture, but also shared democratic norms and a long-term commitment or loyalty to the polity. In the democracy and law category, participants emphasized democratic participation, but also safeguarding and following laws, being in line with the Constitution, for example. And under geography and economy, really those more practice-based ideas of citizenship pop up. So those are about shared experiences, shared space, and kind of common overlaps in social relationships that people have. And in this descriptive table, I only looked at how often arguments from each category are invoked by participants who have ethnic versus civic national identities. And that's based on a very traditional and well-established measure of national identity that asks participants to rate 9 items in terms of their importance for someone being considered genuinely German in this case. So those range from knowing the language, having German ancestors, following traditions, but also democratic participation and following civic obligations. And we see to some extent that there is a logic there. So those with ethnic conceptions most often emphasize commonality and obligations. Those with civic conceptions a little bit more often democracy and law, but it's quite a mixed picture. So it really seems that also there is not a clear division between invoking arguments from those categories based on national identities. And I tried to look at this a little bit more with statistical relationships, and drew inspiration there from an article by Zollinger, who looks also at open-ended survey responses and tries to map them onto traditional measures in terms of how strongly they statistically relate to traditional and closed survey items. And she does this in the same way that I've done it now. So I coded all of the categories as binary variables. That simply indicates that binary variable whether a participant used an argument from that category or not. And then use that as a dependent variable in binary logistic regressions that included those conceptions of national identity, but also some socio-demographic controls. And there are first, perhaps interestingly, quite a few argument categories that showed no statistically significant relationships. Those are the ones that are listed in the right-hand corner here. But there are two in particular that showed quite strong relationships. The first is democracy, where those with civic national identities were much more likely to invoke arguments from this category, and those with ethnic national identities much less so. And the same goes for geography. So participants with ethnic national identities were very unlikely to invoke geography-related arguments. So I think what this just shows is that from that open-ended survey question, there are some arguments that map quite closely or that seem related to national identity conceptions and that are also divisive for them. So those with ethnic versus civic views seem to have very different ideas of whether democracy and geography plays a role for citizenship conceptions. But in the ways that participants reason with this issue in an open-ended survey, there are also quite some aspects that go beyond that. And those aspects also are important, right? Because commonality and obligation was the category that participants invoked actually most often. So to wrap up, I would draw some conclusions for this, which is that open-ended survey responses can help explain some of the nuances of national identity. We know a little bit more about what structures them and what perhaps is divisive about them, but the closed survey item doesn't tell the whole story about what is important to people when they think about whether they would grant access to citizenship rights, especially the commonality and obligation category seemed important for those across kind of different national identity conceptions. And I would say that open-ended questions are quite promising there to expand our perspectives, but also to use closed survey items to validate those open-ended responses and to add to closed survey responses in the future. And I've also tried to, which I didn't have the time to present now, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to talk about it later, try to look at how these open-ended survey responses perhaps map onto other discursive data, for example, from social media. So do people talk about similar aspects there? Are there similar aspects that emerge or not? And I think open-ended survey responses also have a potential there. So that's it from my side. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Franziska. I would like now to ask Rossanna Le Voir from London School of Economics and Political Science to share her contributions. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, but it's not in full. Oh, there it is. It's excellent. We can see everything. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, I can't see you, so let me know if you can't hear me or if there's anything unclear. But yeah, thanks so much, first of all, to the organisers for convening us and giving us a space to present. So I'm Rosie Le Voir. I'm doing my PhD in demography at LSE, London School of Economics. And my professional background is in humanitarian action and development. And so I'm speaking today about surveys in the context of forced migration and displacement. My presentation is based on a paper that I published last year as part of a special issue on internal displacement and health, and uses empirical analysis to critically review how useful surveys can be for researching the health outcomes of displaced people. And I focus on the case of reproductive health in Iraq. And as much as this paper is already published, I'm doing quite a lot of thinking about these types of things in my PhD. So I'd be really welcome and interested to hear any feedback. So for those of you who are less familiar with reproductive health, this map shows the number of women who died from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births, so the maternal mortality ratio. And the UN Population Fund estimates that 3 in 5, so around 60% of maternal deaths, occur in humanitarian or displacement-affected settings. And you'll see here some of the deepest red, of course, is in countries most affected by conflict and humanitarian crises, including Chad, South Sudan, and others. So if sexual reproductive health matters in these kinds of contexts, where does the data come from? So typically data on internal displacement might focus just on the affected population, for example, a camp setting or specific locations at a subnational level. And these may more or less sort of include the host community as well. But at the national level, the main data sources on sexual reproductive health are internationally comparable and nationally representative cross-sectional household surveys, such as MIGNEX, the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, Demographic and Health Survey, DHS, and many others I'm sure you'd be familiar with. So this map or chart here shows that, of course, many of these surveys have been around a while, and the first MIGNEX was done around 1995. And these surveys are also recommended as some of the data sources for the Sustainable Development Goals on sexual reproductive health as well. So I'm interested in sort of what can we learn from these and how far can we use them if we're doing analysis through a displacement lens. So the data for the paper comes from the Iraq MIGNEX from 2018 that was conducted by the National Statistical Office's Ministry of Health and UNICEF. And I use data from the Household and Individual Women's Questionnaire. I use logistic regressions to test associations between my outcome of interest and modern contraceptive use, and then other displacement, demographic, and socioeconomic factors. And this was possible because some displacement screening questions are included as part of the sort of migration section of the household questionnaire. And so there's two variables that I construct, one around reason for last move, so if in relation to conflict or violence, returning home, disasters, land disputes, and evictions, and the relative to other reasons for moving, and then also about previous household residence, so whether households previously lived in a camp or other types of areas such as city, town, or rural areas. And then I use a framework, which again, many of you may be familiar with, so the total survey error framework, to really try and be reflexive about the limits and potential of these data and methods and what we can and cannot learn, and also draw on sort of feminist approaches to data as well. So part of it is about the substantive analysis, but I think most of the discussion and where I see the real value is some of this more reflexive approach. So why Iraq? Iraq is an extreme case of displacement in case study typology. The chart here on the right shows data from the International Organization for Migration's displacement tracking matrix. And you'll see the date that the survey was conducted, so around 2018, was almost at the sort of crossover between the number of internally displaced people and returnees. The Iraq government also published a family planning and birth spacing strategy, which put modern contraceptive use as a national policy priority. And then also feasibility. So like I said, trying to use these types of national surveys where displacement screening questions have been included to look at what's possible. I also lived and worked in Iraq between 2019 and 2020, so also have a personal interest as well. As we know, if we're working in migration, of course, this is one of the most difficult areas to measure. And so I thought it's helpful to highlight here some of the work that's been done by the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics about trying to formulate recommendations to improve technical measurement for internal displacement, refugees, and then also stateless people as well. And you'll see some of the questions here about timing of when people moved, where they moved from and to, and the motivation behind that. And I'll refer back to this in one of the last slides. So in terms of the sort of substantive findings, there is a small negative association between displacement and modern contraceptive use among those who ever move, and particularly households who previously lived in a camp were the women were almost half as likely to use modern contraception relative to other locations of residence. And the probability increased with different factors, for example, federal Iraq relative to the Kurdish region, levels of education, parity of women, so the number of children, age, and then also media exposure. But I think what's probably most of interest to this group is, like I said, sort of taking this reflexive analytical approach to think about what we can and we cannot learn. And I link back here to the total survey error framework. So the first thing is about challenges to defining and measuring displacement. So the data here say nothing about the timing of movement, the duration of displacement, or the place of birth, which is one of the sort of limits if we look at relative to those EGRIS recommendations I showed you before. There's also an important question about whose displacement status is measured. So like I said, these questions were included in the household questionnaire. In Iraq, about 90% of households are male-headed. When linking this to information from the individual women's questionnaire about reproductive health, we're having to use men's experiences of displacement or the head of a household's experiences as a proxy for women's experiences, which may not always, of course, be consistent or the same. In terms of coverage and sampling error, in terms of the survey population, so the people who currently lived in the camps were excluded, and also some of the most conflict-affected districts that were inaccessible to the survey team for security reasons, but which have been disproportionately affected by displacement, were also excluded, like Sinjar and Hawija. This is relevant also in terms of representation, and of course, if a survey is not intended to be able to offer representative data on a particular group, then it's unlikely to stratify by areas with high levels of displacement. So we're likely probably looking at a lower bound, and this, of course, creates problems if we're trying to offer representative data at a national level. Then, of course, some topics, particularly in relation to reproductive health, may be affected by interviewer effects or other effects on reporting. And women, for example, may use contraception without their partner's knowledge. And when we look at the metadata of the Iraq mix, it possibly supports this. So reported use of modern contraception was lowest when interviews were conducted with someone else present, and it was highest when interviews were conducted in private. And then also sort of, particularly in terms of a reproductive health and rights and justice approach, it's really important to highlight that an indicator like modern contraceptive use says nothing about unmarried women, because the questions are at the moment only asked of married women. Men says nothing about access to services or reproductive rights. So you might be thinking, in terms of sort of all these limits and trying to be as sort of critical and reflective as possible, is this data really useful? And I would argue, absolutely yes. We have to make the most and optimize the data that's available. But when we present our findings, we've got to be really clear and transparent about who is and who is not being measured, in what ways, and why this might be, sort of unpacking some of the politics behind the data as well. So just to wrap up, so I hope with this paper I was able to make the most of the data available, even if it is slightly imperfect, to be able to offer some substantive, but most importantly, methodological contributions, and whose feasibility to use some of these surveys that are typically not used or analysed through a displacement lens, and test some of these associations. But then drawing on things like total survey error and feminist approaches to data can really help highlight some of the limits of these data and measures, and hopefully help move the conversation forward and improve them. So thank you very much, and I'll pass to the next.
Thank you very much, Rosie. The next contributor is Rima Saini from Middlesex University London.
Hi, I'm just going to share my screen. Is it sharing the screen or the application that helps with the output?
I don't see.
Sharing the whole window. You need to share the whole window.
So I've got two options, screen application. So would be screen then?
Screen, yes. And then after you get to that, you need to do and say your whole screen rather than a specific application.
Oh, there we go. Yes.
Okay, now let's see.
Here it is.
Right, so can you see the
yes,
whole screen? Okay.
The presentation.
Fantastic. Like Rosie, I can't see any of you right now. So hopefully do let me know or speak out if there's any technical difficulties, please. So my name is Rima Saini. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at Middlesex University in London. So I've been teaching and doing quantitative research and mixed methods research for nearly 10 years now. I primarily analyse and teach with UK-based cross-sectional, sometimes longitudinal data. So the UK survey data from the ESS, the British election minority survey, the citizenship survey, British social attitude survey, and to some extent understanding society as well. I teach sociology, criminology, and have taught in the past at Southampton, Kent, and City University's politics students as well. And I'm essentially going to discuss this sort of project or this kind of discourse and praxis around decolonization in quantitative methods pedagogy. And I'll be picking up on some of the things that have been discussed so far, particularly the tail end of what Rosie was discussing around sort of data and its limitations, but from a decolonial perspective. So I'm sure, or I'm assuming that the sort of the discourse of decolonization from a pedagogical perspective is something that's familiar with a lot of the people in the room. The way that it's sort of taught in the UK, or the way that this discourse is kind of put across in the UK, is around the idea of binaries, which I think is quite apt for a discussion about sort of categories within social survey research. What a colonial curriculum does is it demarcates understandings of modernity from understandings of coloniality, so how the modern world was constructed and co-constituted through colonial relations. It sets aside the theoretical canon from alternative perspectives, quote unquote alternative, sort of non-Western, non-global North theories and bodies of scholarship and knowledge. And then particularly, as is relevant to social survey research and analysis, methodological approaches to analysis. It conceptualizes and tries to create sort of universal principles, which links quite aptly again to discussions around generalizability, particularly of data within social survey and quantitative data predominantly. And it demarcates whiteness and blackness, and it hierarchizes those experiences and those identities. Okay, so decolonization is essentially sort of displacing this Eurocentrism and sort of displacing and decentering Western approaches to knowledge production specifically. So when we're thinking about methodology and we're thinking about sort of data and social research, drawing on sort of non-Western or non-global North traditions is really important in making this journey through sort of decolonization. And indigenous methods, Rosie did mention feminist methods as well, are really important and really useful here. So Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who's a scholar of indigenous methods, describes decolonizing research methods as transforming the institution of research, the underlying structures, and the taken for granted ways of organizing, conducting, and disseminating research knowledge. Okay, so whose knowledge, what knowledge, and so on and so forth. This is really important within survey research with marginalized groups, historically marginalized ethnic minority groups, or with migrant groups who are often vulnerable in many different ways. Wilson, who's written a lot on Indigenous research statistics, talks about the questions that a decolonial methodology then has to ask that might be different from what we're used to within sort of our traditional kind of Western approaches to methodology in social science research. So rather than thinking about validity or reliability, you're asking, how am I fulfilling my role in this relationship? What are my obligations in this relationship? So it's about seeing every research endeavour as a partnership, a co-productive partnership between you and your research participants, even if we're talking about thousands of survey participants, and thinking about the sort of the social justice and the interpersonal and interrelational implications of that. And reflexivity, of course, is inimical to that. And so you have to understand your own positionality as a researcher and as a human being before engaging within that research project. If we think a little bit back historically, as well as to why quantitative methods as a whole, as well as quantitative methods pedagogy might need decolonizing, we have a lot of scholarship as well on Indigenous statistics from Maggie Walter and Anderson, who talk about sort of historical Australian quantitative practice. They say a standard Australian quantitative practice promulgates Indigenous data as benign numerical summaries, presenting a picture that is objectively real. The ontological frame is a presumption of pejorative Indigenous racial cultural difference and a norm of Indigenous deficit. So even though we might class ourselves nowadays as contemporary social researchers, researching migrant or ethnic minority populations as having gone past and are seeking to destabilize this hierarchical quantitative researcher and research subject or research respondent relationship, those colonial understandings of and those colonial hierarchies and binaries, as I mentioned before, are still embedded often within the research process. So if we're thinking about what does it mean to decolonize quantitative methods, and particularly quantitative methods pedagogy, and I'm speaking from a UK perspective here because I've only ever taught quantitative methods in the UK, even though many of the colleagues that I've co-taught with are from across Europe, across the world, from colleagues from India and Pakistan, from America and from South America. We have to sort of bring in that sort of historical and colonial understanding of the development of quantitative methods, not just in terms of sampling approaches and data collection that Maggie, Walter and Anderson were talking about, but also in terms of category construction and in terms of analysis. So as you know, a lot of the quantitative methods that we use to analyze, ones that I wield as well in my research to understand social and political identity frameworks across South Asian diasporas, things like the chi-square test, F-test variants, were used to model racial hierarchies and racial understandings of human difference. And these were eugenicist and colonial methods. So a decolonial pedagogy of quantitative methods goes beyond just sort of challenging sort of racism or challenging hierarchy within research and data analysis to sort of destabilizing and uncovering these colonial histories of social research methods. And it also means, as have so many people been talking about today already, undermining the oppositional positivist interpretist divide and bringing together the qualitative and the quantitative project within our practice and within our pedagogy of social research methods and quantitative methods more specifically. And it's, again, sort of being critical and evaluative about how we measure things like validity and reliability beyond sort of the analytical tests we might do for that. So essentially the thesis of myself and my co-authors, and we've written a paper on this, a book chapter, and we're currently doing a research project around this, is to sort of supplement the traditional focus on technical skills in the quantitative classroom with this sort of critical sociological lens. And some of those activities that you can engage in, or we do try to engage in within our own sort of quantitative classrooms, particularly almost exclusively actually social survey quantitative classrooms, because we tend to predominantly do social survey research in UK quantitative methods teaching, is to do things like interrogating sort of hierarchical binaries and quantitative demographic measures. Why do we still measure things as white, black, Asian, other? What are the practicalities of this in a survey context, but how can these sort of reproduce hierarchical and reductive understandings of race? It's thinking about students' own positionality in politics when they're designing and wielding these measures. It's building the messiness of survey design into assessment itself, and understanding and acknowledging and working with students around it not being a linear process. About critically assessing claims to representatives of large-scale secondary data, and again, as Rosie mentioned, which subgroups might not have been included in what is claimed to be a national snapshot, perhaps, of attitudes and behaviours, for example. This is particularly the case with UK-based data, which I think still falls short when it comes to its ethnic minority and migrant sort of granularity and sample size. It's about interrogating the provenance and the design of large-scale data through the lens of power. And it's evaluating the efficacy of secondary quantitative data through its axiological dimensions. So its social justice goals and those that underpin collection, compilation, dissemination, and usage. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that's my 10 minutes done. I'll stop sharing. And
thank you very much, Rima.
Apologies if that was too...
No, that was...
I was trying to keep the timing.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, right now we have our next contributors, Kesi Mahendran and Nicola Magnusson from the Open University. I'm not sure who will be speaking actually, but or maybe both are. We can see the presentation. It's still not in full.
Yeah, we're going to be co-presenting in case he's going to start.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
I'm wondering if you're on mute, Kesi.
Apologies. Once I put it onto the presentation, I couldn't get the button to unmute myself, so I do it one more time. And now just put the presentation on. Okay, so I hope you're seeing the full screen.
Yeah.
So thanks, everyone. It's very nice to see this come together, especially having been involved in organising it and how it actually seems to be playing out. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this panel. My name is Kesi Mahendran, and I'm going to speak. We're going to spend 5 minutes each presenting a paper that we're working on, which is called Mapping Quali-Quantification Pathways from an Open Interview to a Closed Survey. So just to talk you through a little bit, the processes. It's been a long story, actually. We conducted the work with participants, a whole population study where anyone, irrespective of their degree of migration, could participate in the study. And really back in 2008 in study one, the key thing was that we were asking the sorts of questions that usually get asked of migrants of everyone. And there were 6 questions, you know, are you from the city? How long have you lived here? Have you had any intention to move, or did you move here? Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like you're integrated? And these sorts of questions were actually asked of everybody. In the second study, the number of cities expanded. And in the third study, which is the one that I really want to focus on today, what I did is once people became very interested in the work, decided to look at how we might scale up what I'm calling the migration mobility continuum. Here's the migration mobility continuum. So this, as I say, it came up out of the data in a very sort of grounded qualitative way, the data being interviews, in-depth interviews in focus groups. And what happened really is that people started to distribute. In fact, Rima just talked about sort of breaking down binaries as a part of a sort of decolonization approach. I mean, this is very much really plays to exactly that. I mean, what happened is that people distributed. I mean, there are obviously more than 10 positions, but I've schematized it into 10 positions. I won't spend too long on this because it would just take up the rest of the talk. But suffices to say that people have degrees of migration mobility, and I think that's a really key thing if we're going to understand the relationship between the public and migrants, and indeed the relationship between so-called non-migrants and migrants. And the key one that actually opened it up in the first study was position 4, which is someone who's lived abroad and then come back, and that really changed things. So once I started presenting this schematic, the 10-position migration mobility continuum, which, as I say, if you're interested, it's out there, it's been published for a good while now. The key thing I think that what happened is that you kept asking us how many people are in each of these positions, and I was always being really very much a dialogical qualitative researcher. I was always reluctant to answer because I didn't want to start producing management information data which could be handed to people slightly too easily. So I slowed that process down, and it's only in the last few years, just before the pandemic, that I just took the decision to do a study which did start to quantify the positions. So what I did is I designed a study where people would be asked the 6 questions that we'd always asked qualitatively in in-depth interviews would be asked again in an interactive closed response survey, so we could start looking at what were the trade-offs. And I think that's when I asked Nick to get involved and to write this, to do the analysis with a reasonably fresh pair of eyes and see what she saw in the data. And what I think both Nick and I thought at the beginning of this process is that people would be very free in the first part, when they were allowed to speak freely in a nuanced way, tell their stories, be within context, and have a high degree of positionality. And that somehow when they went to the survey and they were confronted with this drop down of closed responses, that there would be a trade-off, there would be losses. I think we assumed that there were losses, and as Nick's about to present to you, that's not quite what actually happened. So if we look at this, we're just going to look at one question. As I say, the MMC contains 6 questions, and this is in fact the last question. Are you settled, or do you think you will move again or move for the first time if it's someone who has no migration story as such? Then you go over, this is me just literally giving you a screen grab from the interactive survey, and you can see there, sorry, it's a wee bit small, but hopefully you can see it there as a survey question with these closed responses. The closed responses are fully settled, quite settled, could move, planning to move, or undecided. And as I say, we initially thought that closed response means closing down, but I'll pass over to Nick to present what actually happened. You're on mute, Nick.
There we go. Hi, thanks, Kesi. Yeah, so as Kesi was saying, we're very much interested in this sort of shift, if you like. You know, what do participants do when they are invited to shift from a, you know, a qualitative interview space into a survey space? But let me just start by talking through sort of analytically how I've been approaching this. So using a 4-step dialogical analysis, although this is laid out as 4 steps, it's worth bearing in mind that this is obviously not a linear process, but very much sort of back and forth. So, you know, I'm interested in looking at how the participants make sense of the questions, who and what are they addressing in their answers, in their responses, you know, themselves, the interviewer, normative constructions, and what sort of movement takes place in terms of sort of time and space. And this is captured then in this 4-step levels of analysis developed by Kesi and others. And again, you can look up more on this approach in the publications here. But, you know, we're looking to look at how identification work, chronotomes and common sense sort of meaning making is playing out. And so I'd like to just show you then here 2 examples. The first one, PT, in the context of Edinburgh, female, aged 51, with a background of refugee migration. And in terms of the MCC developed by Kesi, this person positions themselves as 7. So Kesi asked this participant, so in the qualitative part of the data collection, are you settled? And so they say, well, I would choose whatever my benefits my child. So yes, from that perspective, I'm settled. So I don't mind at the moment. I feel like I belong. So as you can see, this participant situates their answer within an external identification position of mother, and they are talking in the present. They close the question down as such. They could have opened it up, and interestingly, they talk about not minding and feeling this sense of belonging when they actually haven't been asked about their belonging. In terms of sort of, the way in which the participant has drawn on normative constructions, they are sort of saying, well, as a parent, one puts one's child first. Interestingly, when they are asked to choose from a drop-down box in the survey space, they choose that they could move. And here we see a positional shift then as sort of as someone as a potential mover, thinking about those options. And again, quite interestingly, in terms of time and space, their position shifts to, their response shifts to something futuristic, and they open up the options more themselves. In terms of this participant, again, it's in the context of Edinburgh. 38-year-old male has moved from England to Scotland, positions themselves as position 5. And this, again, they were asked, are you settled? And this participant speaks to the sort of the existential nature of that question. Am I settled? I'm happy with where I am. I could easily live another 40 years here. And then equally, they play with the option that in 8 years, I might go, go somewhere else. And only got one life. So they've positioned themselves, sort of dialogically speaking, as a potential mover, and but at the same time happy where they are. They have got a present future sort of direction going on. They open up the question, and they draw on the sort of common discourse of sort of only having one life in terms of that self-justification of what they do with this response. When shifted into the quantitative space, they take a little time in deciding, but they decide on quite settled. So there we see again a positional shift dialogically in terms of I as settled, happy, placing themselves in terms of another 40 years. A sort of, there's longevity to their lifespan, and I as only having one life. They talk in the present, so they've shifted from a present to future, and they open up the question. It's not unusual that we see this shift from a qualitative response to a quantitative. Yes, that was the right way around. Qualitative to quantitative was the direction. But it's we are also asking ourselves how much this is occurring due to the design. You can see here that, very concretely, I feel settled. By the end of this interview, this participant had actually decided they were moving again. Kesi spoke, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? I think so. I'm nearly finished. In terms of, interview space and survey space, Kesi spoke to the fact that we had made, to be honest, a few assumptions, and we thought that the interview space where people were able to narrate their kind of lives and their ways of seeing the choices they've made, as, you know, being quite a sort of grounding space and giving, you know, a lot of freedom. However, we are actually seeing the opposite is taking place, and that the interview space, although it's a wide open space, it is perhaps an exposing space. And so there are certain considerations participants have to make, you know, against the background of that exposure, whereas the survey space seems to actually present a more private space to participants. So although surveys are considered a more closed method, perhaps, we're seeing in our data that they're having a grounding effect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think that's the key takeaway, is that we had thought that it would close it down, but actually what we're sensing is that these two different spaces create different audience effects, and that there may be an interview effect that occurs with the interview as open-ended that just isn't occurring in the surveys, so they can actually show their hand more clearly in the survey. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Kesi. Thank you, Nicola. And we have one more contribution. We have Mariña Fernandez Reino and Madeleine Sumption from the University of Oxford. So I welcome you very much. And then we open the discussion. We see your presentation. We cannot hear you. Maybe you are muted. We just saw your presentation quite well, but you might be muted. I might try to unmute you as well.
Yeah,
I unmuted you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There it is. Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So just your screen right now.
Yeah. Okay. So now you can see the screen, right? Yeah. So yeah, this is an ongoing project that just started like 3-4 months ago. We are still at the moment in the questionnaire design phase. So any feedback is very much welcome. This project also, my co-investigator is not here. She's Madeleine Sumption, and she's also based as me at COMPAS, the Center of Migration at the University of Oxford. So the first question here is why conducting a survey on EU migrants in the UK? First of all, there's the mainstream data sources with large enough samples to study, in particular, the EU migrant population, which are mostly the annual population survey and the census, have very few variables that are relevant for immigration policy and also migration research. There's also no specific models for migrant population. In the case of UK, as a consequence of Brexit, UK pulled out of the EU labour force survey as of 2020. So the ad hoc model that was conducted in 2021 in the rest of the countries on migrants and their descendants is not available in the case of the UK. And there's also a huge policy and academic interest on the situation of EU migrants in the UK since Brexit, and in particular since the end of free movement in end of 2020. Issues like the identity, naturalization rates, interactions with immigration system, migration plans, etc., are issues that both academics and policymakers are particularly interested in, but we don't have data basically on that. So our survey, just to summarize, our intention is to investigate EU citizens' experience with the new immigration system as subjects that are now as people that are now subject to immigration control. Also will be an online survey around 15 minutes of duration, and there will be a core common questionnaire that everybody will reply, and then specific models that will be randomized, just not to make the length of the questionnaire increase so much the length of the questionnaire. And there will be non-probability sample because respondents will be mostly recruited through Facebook ads. We from different nationalities, so we will adapt the different ads to the different nationalities nationalities that we will target. We aim to achieve a sample of around 4,000 individuals. Regarding the survey models, so the core models that we would like to include, some questions might at the end not make it, but our intention is to include basic information, ask respondents about their social demographics, in particular issues of nationality, year of birth, their economic activity. Also the migration, very brief migration history and settlement intentions, basically what the presenters just been discussing now, whether they intend to move again in the future or whether they want to settle in the UK. And then the main questions we're interested in are the understanding of their own immigration status. Basically, first of all, to identify what is their immigration status. As you know, since Brexit, since the end of free movement, all EU citizens living in the UK needed to have a residence permit that it's called settle or pre-settle status, depending on whether it's temporary or permanent. So we will intend to ask questions on legal status sequentially. Also, respondents who do not hold any status, whether they are aware of the legal requirement to have one. Respondents with temporary status is whether they are aware of the conditions to obtain a permanent status in the future. Then we will also like to have some information about the characteristics of respondents that may affect compliance with immigration rules. In particular, how difficult they find applying and whether they require assistance to apply and what type of assistance they require, whether they have absences of more than six months, because that will make some of them ineligible for getting permanent residence in the future, and some basic questions of administrative literacy, in particular in relation to the immigration system. We also would like to have information about the perceptions of status security, especially the ability to digitally access the status if required, because in the UK, you need to have to show proof of your status, which is a digital status, every time you access the labor market and sometimes also the health system and the housing market, and whether they have faced difficulties proving their status. And then the models that we'd only ask half of the sample are the naturalization intentions, in particular, whether they intend to do it and the reasons for that or for not doing that, and political trust towards the UK state in general, but also in particular to the Home Office. We will try to incorporate some questions on political trust that have been asking other surveys, and also ask them about the specific situations and why the extent to which they trust the UK state in that regard. At the moment, some of the let's say issues that are most concerned, because they are, let's say, like the core of our survey, is about measuring the immigration status. So basically how to minimize non-response, because usually most surveys don't include questions about people's immigration status. They just include either citizenship, and usually citizenship, at least in the UK. And also how to measure the knowledge of conditions attached to the immigration status in a way that respondents do not feel that they are being tested, so that might increase the probability of them dropping out the survey. So at the moment, we are particularly working on that. We are still in the questionnaire design. We haven't conducted any cognitive interviews yet, but any feedback on this will be greatly appreciated. Thanks.